At the bottom of Florida's stagnant swamp, a horrifying dark web larger than 3 ships suddenly emerged. Under the green glow of night vision, the water floor wasn't mud at all, but hundreds of gray-white tubes writhing like giant snakes, silently converging on our small boat. The entire swamp was dead still, not a breath of wind, an eerie silence that sent chills down your spine. Suddenly, a dark shadow shot up from beneath the water. When the propeller got tangled, I was at the gunwale scanning the water with night vision. With a sharp crack, the engine dropped from 3,000 RPM to zero, the boat lurched forward, and my chest slammed into the aluminum rail, knocking a lens off the night vision. The boatman cursed and reached for the ignition switch. The moment his fingers touched the button, a gray-green spray churned up from the water around the propeller, mixed with shredded black fibers. Those fibers were still moving. I leaned over the side to look down. There was a tube under the water. Thicker than my thigh, grayish, its surface covered in small pores arranged in spiraling rows. Those pores were opening and closing, like nostrils gasping for air. The tube itself was expanding and contracting, in a slow rhythm, each pulse churning up mud from the bottom. The air was thick with the smell of hot fuel and strong acid. One breath felt like swallowing a red-hot blade. I looked up. Everything was green in the night vision. The C-12 liaison plane was less than 80 yards ahead. At first, I didn't recognize it as a plane. It was pierced by dozens of those gray tubes from all directions. They had punched through the fuselage, burst out of the windows, and several were tightly wrapped around the wings, crushing the aluminum skin into deep dents. The wing was bending backward right before my eyes. The wingtip had already touched the horizontal stabilizer, the aluminum bulging into folds at the bend, rivets popping out one by one, clinking as they fell into the cabin. The cabin was pitch black, and the sound of the rivets dropping echoed for a while. The surfaces of those tubes began to ooze something. Milky white, sticky, seeping from the pores on the tube walls. A drop of the slime hit the wing, and the aluminum instantly erupted in a dense rash of toxic bubbles, like boiling water. Each bubble burst with a hiss, releasing a puff of white smoke. The white smoke trickled down the wing, spreading a thin layer of mist over the water. The boatman shouted something, but I didn't catch it. My ears were filled with that hissing sound. It took me 6 hours to figure out what that hissing was. Let me rewind. We got the mission yesterday at noon. A distress signal forwarded by the Florida Emergency Services Bureau. A C-12 Huron liaison plane lost radar contact north of the Lost Man Swamp after taking off from Homestead Base. Our squad of 12, 3 airboats, pushed into the swamp from a tributary of the Tamiami Canal. The first 3 hours were normal. The sun was blazing, alligator snapping turtles lay motionless on driftwood, and the air smelled of rotting leaves and wet mud. I leaned against the gunwale smoking, while the boatman chewed on an unlit cigar, rambling about the largemouth bass he caught last month. Then the water changed. After passing that row of crooked cypress trees, the water suddenly changed. The tea-brown color faded instantly, replaced by a dead, gray-green stillness so clear you could see 6 feet to the muddy bed. The sawgrass roots that should have been there were gone, replaced by something I'd never seen before. Gray tubes, each 2 to 4 inches thick, lying on the mud, their surfaces marked with vertical lines, looking like peeled tendons. They swayed gently with the weak current. I dipped the boat paddle down. The tip hit the stuff, feeling like hard rubber, bouncing back. When I lifted the paddle, there was a dark mark on the metal edge, as if burned by something. The boatman saw it too. He took the cigar out of his mouth, stared at the mark for 2 seconds, and said nothing. The sun was directly overhead. Something was flowing inside those tubes, murky, with a flickering yellow glow. The radio man leaned in from behind, saying the radio was acting up. Every 7 seconds, a dull thud in the headphones, perfectly rhythmic. He let me listen. It was a hollow, unsettling sound, like someone far away beating a big drum. We drove through the gray-green water for nearly 3 more hours to reach the coordinates. The first thing I saw was the C-12's tail fin. It stuck out of the water, tilted at an angle that felt wrong. A plane shouldn't be standing like that. On the tail fin was printed, U.S. Army, half of it covered by a white, semi-dried substance, like glue about to set. The bottom right of the letter R was gone, leaving a sticky trail, the metal edge collapsing inward. The boats fanned out. Ours approached from the left wing. About 50 yards from the hull, something pushed up from underneath the boat. The whole vessel steadied for a moment, lifted 2 inches, then gently settled back down. All 3 of us on board felt it, our bodies dipping and rising with the motion. The skipper leaned down to check the bilge pump, which was sucking out water mixed with grayish-white fibrous strands. Tiny, fragmented things writhing in the pooled water. I shouted for everyone to check their weapons. M4S chambered, magazines slapped tight. 20 yards? At that distance, I saw the main root wrapped around the port engine nacelle. It was at least 4 feet in diameter. What I thought from afar were pores on its surface were actually opening up, sinking inward, layered like concentric rings of muscle contracting in unison. With each contraction, it expelled a blast of hot, eye-stinging acid. The edges of those openings were lined with translucent spines, each one bending and straightening independently, out of sync with the others. Then it made a sound. A long, dull hiss, *ZZZZ*, with a metallic tremor. It was the sound of aluminum dissolving in acid, releasing hydrogen, echoing from some cavity, amplified, like a massive bellows slowly drawing in air. The skipper's cigar dropped into the bilge water, fizzling out with a hiss. The skipper's cigar was still bubbling in the water when the main root wrapped around the engine nacelle moved. The aluminum frame of the nacelle warped before my eyes, from round to oval, then to crumpled foil. Rivet holes stretched and deformed, layers of aluminum folding inward, collapsing the entire compartment by more than half in 3 seconds. Aviation fuel sprayed from a ruptured line, hitting the root's surface. The moment it touched that milky white mucus, a chemical reaction exploded. White smoke billowed up, at least 30 feet high, carrying a wave of scorching acid. It felt like a red-hot coal had been shoved down my throat. My eyes burned so badly I couldn't open them, tears and snot streaming down my face. The skipper was shouting something, but his voice was drowned out by the screech of twisting metal. I wiped my eyes with my sleeve and, through the blur of tears, saw Cunningham on the right flank already raising his M4. Cunningham was the type to do everything a beat slow, but this time he fired faster than anyone. 3-round burst, pop, 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 the muzzle flash flickering 3 times over the gray-green water. The rounds hit the nearest surface root. The impact tore a fist-sized hole in the grayish-white tube wall. The edges of the hole curled inward unnaturally, like sliced rubber peeling back, revealing a bright yellow spongy interior. Inside the tube was a nauseating yellow sponge, with sharp metal fragments lodged in it, grinding violently with every pulse. The sound was like shoving aluminum foil into a fan running at full speed. Then the tube started spraying something. A gray-green slurry, pressurized like a fire hose, shooting at least 15 feet. Most of it splattered across Cunningham's chest plate. The ceramic insert immediately began to bubble, dense, tiny bubbles covering the entire surface, popping with the same fizz as soda poured into a glass. The plate was eaten through in 3 seconds. I watched the ceramic layer collapse from the center, sinking, dissolving, the edges curling up to reveal the softened Kevlar backing underneath. That's when Cunningham started screaming. He looked down at the mess on his chest, dropped his rifle, and clawed at the plate with both hands. The moment his fingertips touched the residual slurry on the surface, the skin turned white and blistered, like he'd plunged his fingers into boiling oil. I didn't make it over to him, because the yellow spongy tissue inside the punctured tube was growing, right before my eyes. It extended an inch every second, swelling, splitting, swelling again, the tips splitting into finer tendrils that whipped around aimlessly in the air, sticking to whatever they touched, the aluminum hull, nylon ropes, the raincoat the skipper had left on the seat. Once stuck, they started secreting that milky white mucus, corroding everything on contact. I looked down at my feet. The grayish-white fibrous strands that had been writhing in the bilge water were now alive, rising from the surface and wrapping around the laces of my combat boots. "Fall back!" I yelled. The skipper had already fired up the engine. The motor roared, but the propeller spun 3 times in vain. The water was choked with those fibers, tangling the blades, the tachometer needle jumping erratically. He cursed something worse, slammed the throttle, and the engine screamed in agony. The boat began to shudder, as if something from below was dragging it down like it was stuck in mud. Then I couldn't hold on anymore. The entire root network underwater shifted. The bow of the motorboat was violently shoved upward from directly beneath, the aluminum hull lifting at a 45-degree angle out of the water. I was thrown backward, my head smacking against the spare water tank at the stern, and everything went black for a moment. When I opened my eyes again, I saw the part of the boat's bottom that had been pushed above the surface. The aluminum hull was covered in that milky white mucus, dripping down, with several grooves already dented into the soft metal, sagging like a candle left out for days. Right in the center of the hull, where it had been forced up, a crack was spreading outward on the aluminum sheet. Cunningham was still on the boat. He was slumped under his own seat, his shield completely wrecked, a large clump of gray-green slime stuck to the front of his combat uniform, still bubbling. The medic jumped over from the trailing boat to drag him out, but as soon as his feet hit the deck, he slipped. The water on the floor was already ankle-deep, mixed with acidic slime draining from Cunningham's shield. Where the medic's boots touched the water, the soles immediately softened and sank. I didn't have time to check on the other two boats. I just heard Martinez on boat 2 firing, full auto, emptying a magazine into the water. The muzzle flash flickered in the dark, illuminating the shadows of those tubular things beneath the surface, countless numbers of them. They were rising from the muddy bed, like a swarm of gray-white snakes lifting their heads from the silt. Boat 3 tried to flank and support us. The skipper yelled for me to jump over. The two boats were about 8 feet apart, with a layer of aviation fuel from the C-12's leaking tank floating on the water between them. Beneath the fuel, I could see 3 tubular forms slowly intertwining, twisting into a knot. As I swung one leg over the gunwale, the knot underwater suddenly tightened. All 3 tubes contracted at once, crushing a piece of C-12 wreckage aluminum caught in the middle into a crumpled ball. The sound of metal grinding against metal was crisp, like snapping a thick branch. Wrapped by the 3 tubes, that aluminum ball was dragged from under the water down into the mud bed, releasing a long string of bubbles as it sank into the deep silt. Each bubble burst on the surface, puffing out a small wisp of white smoke. The skipper grabbed the back collar of my tactical vest and yanked me back from the gunwale. Boat 3 couldn't get closer. Gray-green foam started churning between the 2 boats, the water roiling with countless tubes thrashing underneath. I leaned over the side for a second. Directly beneath the boat, the mud bed was sinking, forming a circular depression larger than both my boats combined. The edges of the silt slid inward, like a funnel drain. That low-frequency pulse, every 7 seconds, transmitted straight up through the hull's aluminum, vibrating through the metal until my soles went numb. All 3 boats, finally tied up to the same cypress mound. Calling it high ground was generous. It was just a few cypress roots tangled together on a mud pile, exposed above the water and covered in moss. We lashed the boats to the roots, water still seeping from the hulls. 2 men carried Cunningham onto the roots. His shield had been stripped off and left in the water by the boat, the ceramic plate as soft as plasterboard pulled from water. I stepped on it, and my boot sank into a dent, pulling out strands when I lifted it. The medic knelt beside him, cutting open the front of his combat uniform with scissors. His chest was covered in horrific dissolution burns from the high-temperature acid mist. His skin hadn't even touched the slime directly, just the acidic vapor had done this. The medic slapped burn dressings on him, each one soaked through immediately, then another. The sun was setting. The swamp's sunset was orange-red, casting a warm glow on the C-12 wreckage, the aluminum fuselage reflecting a soft light. That main root was still coiled around the wreck, but the contractions of the holes were slowing. Earlier, they pulsed every 2 seconds. Now, they moved every 10 seconds. The metallic creaking had also softened, becoming dull, rhythmic sounds drifting slowly from the wreck. The comms operator crouched on the other end of the roots, holding the satellite phone above his head, turning to find a signal. He said the pulse interference was still there, every 7 seconds without stopping, but much weaker than before. He thought the interference source was only in the water near the wreck. We pulled back over 100 yards, likely outside its range. Hearing that, A few people nearby breathed a sigh of relief. The skipper put his unlit cigar back in his mouth. Staring at the wreck, he muttered, "This thing's probably eating. Once it's full, maybe it'll stop." As he spoke, his right fingers unconsciously tapped a rhythm on the boat's aluminum gunnel. I crouched beside him, listening to the tapping for a while. Every 7 seconds. Thump, thump, thump. He didn't even notice. It was almost dark. The light on the water shifted from orange to deep purple, then from deep purple to black. When I turned on the flashlight and shone it on the surface, the beam illuminated things floating in the water: cypress leaves, broken water hyacinth roots, a few half-rotted branches, all suspended at the same depth beneath the surface, arranged neatly with even spacing, as if laid out on a transparent glass plate. When I switched off the flashlight, it was pitch black. When I turned it back on, they were still there, arrayed tightly around the hull like a formation. The radio man whispered that the interference had gotten a bit stronger. At 1 in the morning, I was on watch. Cunningham lay on the driest spot among the tree roots. The medic crouched beside him, changing dressings every so often. The yellow blisters on his chest had started to merge, the individual bumps fusing into a patch, the edges spreading outward slowly. The medic had used up most of the dressings he brought, and the boat's first aid kit was empty. Cunningham was awake, eyes open, staring at the sky, silent. The boatman dozed against the cypress roots, his fingers still resting on the aluminum rail of the boat. The water was dead calm, not a breath of wind. But the water hyacinths, scattered everywhere during the day, were now drifting upstream. They were moving, each cluster heading in the same direction, away from the shadow under our boat. They slid across the surface silently, their roots trailing and swaying in the shallow water. Something massive underwater was clearly pushing them along. I turned on the flashlight and shone it directly beneath the boat. The water was still gray-green, and the beam cut through with decent visibility. On the muddy bed directly under the hull, the tangled network of tubes that had been scattered haphazardly during the day had been completely rearranged. They formed a circle, ring after ring, expanding outward with our boat as the center, at least 30 feet wide. Each tube was slowly writhing along the circumference, carving arc-shaped grooves into the mud. The grooves varied in depth. The older ones were already deeply indented, while newer ones were still being etched outward. At the center, directly beneath our boat, the mud bed was sinking. Something below was sucking it in. A funnel-shaped depression had formed in the middle of the silt, with fine bubbles rising from the surrounding mud. The depression was still growing. The boatman woke up then. He saw me leaning over the side and came over to look too. We each took a side, our flashlight beams converging, shining straight into the center of the funnel. A sack-like thing bulged up from beneath the mud, enormous, with coarse wrinkles on its surface, filled with liquid that glowed a hazy orange-yellow under the light. I handed him the thermal imager's display. The temperature inside that sack had spiked from a background of 70 degrees to over 110, the liquid churning violently, a patch of orange-yellow spreading outward from the core. The boatman switched off my flashlight. He whispered, "Stop shining it." He took the flashlight from my hand, moving slowly. At the wreck site, it should have been quiet by now. The contraction frequency of those tubes during the day had dropped to once every 10 seconds, but the sounds now were wrong. Large pieces of aluminum were being crushed into fragments in some kind of pressing structure, a fine, grating noise, with debris being pushed forward through the pipes along the walls, producing a sound that was both piercing and muffled. A sour smell drifted over from the wreck's direction, stronger than during the day, so intense that even wearing a tactical mask with a filter couldn't block it. Every breath carried that taste. The astringent tang of aluminum salts, mixed with a sweet organic acid, sticky and clinging to the roof of the mouth. The radio man crawled over from the tree roots, moving fast, clutching the satellite phone. His face looked bad. The blue glow of the screen lit it up, and I saw his lips were pale. He stared at the screen, fixated. "This damn thing is weighing us. The more people on a boat, the louder the pulse." I instantly thought of Cunningham. During the day, that thing had locked all its jets onto him, following the weight. The radio man handed me the satellite phone. On the screen was a line he typed. "We're standing on a digestive net. We've been on it since the moment we entered the coordinates." Martinez was the third. Cunningham was the first, the medic was the second. The medic didn't scream, but his fingers kept trembling when he changed Cunningham's dressings. The tweezers couldn't grip the gauze, dropping it 3 times. Martinez was different. Martinez suddenly stood up from the stern, bolt upright, the flashlight beam cutting straight into the water. He was shining it at the concentric circles directly beneath the boat. The beam swept across the water, clearly illuminating the rings of tubes. The gaps between each ring were all the same, 3 feet. I eyeballed it, and it was exactly 3 feet, no more, no less. 3 feet. That spacing was all too familiar. It was exactly the width of an adult man's shoulders. Martinez said nothing. He grabbed his M4, pointed the muzzle downward, and squeezed the trigger into the root net beneath the water. Full auto. He emptied the 30-round magazine in one go. The muzzle flash flickered a long string of orange-yellow light in the darkness. Bullets pierced the water, leaving dense trails of bubbles. The flashlight beam hit those bubbles, and every bullet path was crystal clear. The rounds struck the tubular structures, blowing open their walls. High-pressure slurry sprayed outward, just like during the day, but this time was different. This time, every hit tube contracted simultaneously, and the high-pressure slurry locked onto the bolt like a water jet, blasting relentlessly. Acidic liquid poured in through the existing corrosion holes in the hull. The water level in the cabin jumped from ankle-deep to calf-deep in seconds. The soles of my combat boots treaded through the water, the rubber treads pressing against the aluminum hull. With every step, I could feel the treads thinning. Each time I lifted my foot, sticky strands of rubber pulled away between the sole and the aluminum plate. The boat captain grabbed a plastic scoop and started bailing water. After 3 scoops, on the 4th, the scoop's edge touched the water surface. The plastic edge instantly softened, sagged, and warped into a twisted shape. He tossed the scoop aside and started splashing water with his hands. The skin on the edges of his palms, where they touched the water, turned red and blistered. Martinez swapped in a second magazine. He fired and howled at the same time. Shell casings clattered against the gunwale. One casing fell into the standing water. The part submerged below the surface had its coating eaten away within seconds, revealing shiny brass underneath, which then began to blacken. I wanted to grab him. As soon as I took a step forward, the hull shuddered violently. Dozens of those tubular structures beneath the water simultaneously detached from the mud bed and lifted themselves out of the silt. The airboat was hoisted from directly below. The aluminum hull left the water, buoyancy vanished. The entire boat, plus the gear of 12 men, the spare water tank, the toolbox, the spare propeller, all that weight pressed down on the aluminum hull. The corrosion holes in the hull began to tear outward. Cracks extended along the weakened lines etched by the mucus, spreading at 2 inches per second. I crouched to look. The cracks were connecting the holes, threading them together. In a moment, all the holes would link into a single line. The radio man lay prone at the bow, the satellite phone antenna upright. He shouted "Mayday" into the mic. After 2 calls, the signal cut out again. He raised the phone, tried a different direction. The signal bar on the screen flickered once, then flatlined. The hull began to sink. In my mind, I saw the image, the cracks fully connected, the hull splitting in half, 12 men falling into chest-deep gray-green water. Beneath the surface, acidic slurry and undigested aluminum fragments, the tubular root net blanketing the entire mud bed. Then the image in my head froze. On one detail. When bullets hit the tubular structures, the struck tube contracted, and the surrounding tubes reacted with a slight delay. 0.7 seconds. I suddenly recalled the details from the daytime firefight. Those tubes had a 0.7 second reaction delay. Like hydraulic pressure pushing through a pipe. Hydraulic pressure. If I just stirred up the water, its hydraulic signal wouldn't transmit. No need for any damn biology, just cause chaos. When I stood up, the boat captain was tapping on the aluminum gunwale. still tapping that 7-second rhythm. I grabbed his hand. Stop tapping. Strip everything aluminum off the boat. The water tank. The toolbox. The spare propeller. All of it. The captain stared at me. Use your bayonet to pry. If that doesn't work, use the hatchet to chop. When the aluminum hits the water and touches the acidic slurry, it'll heat up and bubble. The heat signature will be bigger than ours. The bubbles will reflect sound louder than we do. I'm making a decoy underwater. The crew started dismantling things. Martinez was still standing at the stern, holding a third magazine, but he didn't load it. He heard what I said. The hatchet struck the aluminum casing of the spare water tank. Clang, 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 3 blows split a seam. The remaining fresh water inside gushed out, flowing into the cabin's standing water, raising the level another notch. The bayonet pried at the toolbox rivets. One rivet flew off, followed by an aluminum plate being yanked free, its edges torn into jagged shreds. The spare propeller blades were removed, still clinging to dried black residue from water weeds. All the stripped aluminum was piled in one corner of the boat. I pointed at Martinez. Throw them into the water one by one. Start from far away. Toss the first piece 25 feet out. Watch the tube's reaction. If they turn toward it, throw the next piece farther out. Martinez loaded the magazine into his M4. He looked me in the eye. Then he glanced down at the pile of aluminum on the deck, and back up at the pitch-black water in the direction of the wreckage. The camp fell silent for a moment. Only the faint sound of the hull crack spreading, and Cunningham's heavy breathing. When Martinez threw the first aluminum plate into the water, the flashlight in my hand was aimed right at the spot where it landed. The aluminum plate, pried off the backup water tank, was about 2 feet square, its edges covered in burrs from the bayonet. It flipped over as it hit the water, sinking flat side down into the gray-green liquid. The plate touched the dissolved acidic slurry at the bottom, and the reaction came faster than I expected. A burst of white bubbles exploded across the contact surface, so dense that the plate vanished entirely within the foam. The bubble cloud expanded underwater, growing from 2 feet to 4, then to 6, each bubble rising to the surface, popping with a hiss and releasing a wisp of white smoke. The aluminum plate's temperature spiked. On the thermal imager, that patch of water jumped from the deep blue of the background to orange-red, with the center turning white. Under the flashlight, the whole bubble cloud looked like a mass of water boiling underwater, churning and bubbling violently. The tubular things under the boat stopped. All of them halted their concentric, writhing motion at the same instant. The lifting force that had been pushing our boat upward vanished abruptly, and the steam launch dropped from being raised 12 inches back onto the water's surface. The aluminum hull slapped the water with a loud crack, and the boat swayed left and right 3 or 4 times. The cracks in the hull tore another 2 inches wider from the impact, and the water seeping through them into the boat doubled its pace. But at least the boat was floating again. The reaction of those tubular things underwater was more direct than I'd imagined. They all turned their mouths around, their massive bodies wrenching themselves free from the mud bed one after another. Shining the flashlight into the water, I saw that each tube had a mouth at the end that had detached from the mud, identical to the one I'd seen on the main route in the C-12 engine compartment during the day. 5-lobed splits, with layers of sphincter rings contracting in sync, and translucent barbs along the edges all standing erect, glistening wetly in the flashlight beam. Hanging from the barbs were half-digested aluminum shavings from the C-12 fuselage, fine metal particles embedded in the transparent tips, reflecting silver specks as the barbs swayed. All the mouths turned toward the bubble cloud at once. The boat captain leaned over the gunwale, his flashlight also pointing that way. The beams crossed on the bubble cloud, and I could see the tubes converging on the aluminum plate from all directions. Their bodies undulated through the water like snakes, but much longer, each one continuously pulling out from the mud bed, stretching longer and longer until it became clear. They were all connected beneath the mud. Buried in the mud was a complete sack-like main body, and those tubes were just its extending branches. The funnel directly under our boat, which had been sucking up mud, stopped. The silt ceased sinking. The The sack structure began to roll upward from beneath the mud bed, the thick layer of mud on its surface cracking open, with fissures spreading from the center outward. Mud slid off the sack walls in chunks, revealing the gray-white tissue beneath. The tissue pulsed like a heartbeat, each pulse pushing ripples outward through the surrounding water. I raised the second aluminum plate, a spare propeller blade, over my head and hurled it with all my strength toward a spot 25 feet off the starboard stern. The blade tumbled twice in the air, its edge catching a white flash from the flashlight, then slapped into the water, raising a much bigger splash than the first. Before the sound of the impact faded, the underwater reaction kicked in. Sweeping the flashlight over, I saw the tube's underwater arrangement shift from concentric circles to a fan shape, the fan's midline pointing unerringly at the propeller blade's landing spot. The turn was much faster than before, and as the tubes cut through the water, they stirred up mud and waterweed, leaving gray-green murky trails on the surface. The mouths of those tubes led the way, their bodies trailing behind, dozens of mouths converging on the same point from different directions. By then, the sack structure in the middle of the mud bed had risen halfway. It bulged up from the silt, its size absurdly huge. All three of our boats combined wouldn't match half its volume. The sack wall was densely covered with tiny holes, each one expelling that gray-green slurry, which spread through the water, dyeing the surrounding area the same gray-green as the C-12 wreckage site during the day. The flashlight penetrated the translucent sack wall. Inside were layers upon layers of terrifying stomachs. Massive metal debris was being crushed and dissolved by strong acid into a silvery metallic slurry. The metallic sweetness in the air was so thick it tasted astringent on the tongue, and every breath made the root of my tongue go numb. The boat captain kept bailing water beside me. He had no choice. The crack in the hull was letting in water that had already risen past his calves, and a slick of acidic slurry from below floated on the surface. He used a spare lunchbox to scoop it out, each dip leaving another layer of foam on the water. The foam was yellow, piling up in a big patch against the outer side of the hull, glowing like sulfur under the flashlight beam. Martinez kept tossing aluminum plates. He didn't wait for my orders anymore. The toolbox plates, the remaining side panels from the water tank, a spare shovel's aluminum handle, he ripped off each piece and threw it overboard. Every plate hitting the water triggered a new cloud of bubbles, and each bubble cloud drew more tubules toward farther targets. The area around the steamboat started clearing out. The tubules directly beneath the hull slid out one by one from the shadow of the boat, chasing hotter, bigger, bubble-denser targets. For a moment, I thought this plan might actually work. The radio man's satellite phone suddenly activated. The signal light flicked from red to green, staying lit for about 2 seconds. He screamed Mayday into the mic, shouted the coordinates, shouted the emergency code. I don't know if anyone received it, but the light went red again, faster this time, flashing once before dying. The 7-second pulse tone vanished from the headphones at the same time. The radio man pulled off his headset and looked at me, his eyes huge in the green glow of the equipment lights. The pulse was gone. That thing no longer needed to detect where we were. All the tubules were above the water, their mouths fully open, each aimed at a reacting aluminum plate. The sack-like structure on the mud bed had completely flipped out, the whole thing squatting on the mud, the chambers in its walls pulsing faster and faster, internal pressure building higher and higher. The sack's surface started bulging with fist-sized protrusions, each one venting smoke. The smoke formed chains of bubbles underwater, rising to the surface and bursting, each burst releasing an acidic smell more choking than all the previous ones combined. Then the mud beneath the sack structure exploded. Mud and waterweed debris shot up from below in a high-pressure blast, spraying a mud column over a dozen feet high above the water. Next came a gush of thick yellow slurry, mixed with semi-digested aluminum paste, hot enough to sizzle as it hit the cold water, crackling on contact. That yellow slurry congealed into greasy smoke in the air, rolling across the water toward our boat. The tactical mask's filter failed within 15 seconds. The first breath of that smoke, I can't describe the taste. My tongue felt like it was sandpapered, my palate and gums went numb simultaneously, and my throat felt coated in hot grease. My comrades coughed violently, their voices nearly gone from the acid burn. That's when Martinez stepped onto the gunwale. He held the last aluminum plate, the biggest one from the toolbox, about 3 feet by 2 feet, thick aluminum, the base plate of the steamboat's onboard toolbox. He held it at chest level, gripping the top edge, the veins on the backs of his hands bulging. He looked at me. Then he jumped into the water. The gray-green water, chest deep, made him stumble as it reached his waist. There was a root net below. He stepped on a tubule, its mouth sliding away from under his foot. He steadied himself, holding the plate as he moved away from the boat. Every step landed on a tubule, each one slipping aside under his weight, the pressure sending those mouths into a brief frenzy, thrashing wildly between the hot aluminum plate and his legs. He held the plate high, the wind making the metal hum. I raised my M4 from the gunwale, the muzzle aimed at the water behind him. He'd gone far enough, about 40 feet, at the mouth of Cypress Hill Cove, beyond which lay open water. White smoke from the aluminum plate's heat rose between his hands, shrouding him in a white mist. I pulled the trigger. The rounds hit the water 5 feet behind him. The shockwave and bubbles from each bullet's impact were dozens of times greater than those from his plate. 20 rounds into the same area, the spray merged into a wall of white foam. The massive water blast sounded like a death knell, and the whole stretch of water erupted. All the tubules turned at once. They pulled away from under the boat, from the mud bed, from around the sack structure, their bodies cutting through the water, trailing wakes that churned up water hyacinths and cypress leaves. The mouths arrived first, then the bodies coiled around, layering one after another in the water behind Martinez. The underwater cloud of bubbles and white smoke was swallowed by dozens of mouths simultaneously. The sack structure on the mud bed let out a sound I still can't describe to this day. Low frequency. It thumped against my chest. The vibration lasted about 3 or 4 seconds, then the outermost chambers on the cyst wall simultaneously opened their excretion pores, blasting out half-digested aluminum slag and acidic slurry all at once. Thick yellow jets shot from dozens of pores, carving murky columnar trails underwater, all aimed at Martinez's position. The tubular organism's mouth sealed off that patch of water completely. The exothermic reaction of the aluminum plates was still ongoing, bubbles seeping through the gaps in the layer tubes but growing weaker. Martinez's aluminum plates were at the center of that mass. Martinez was there too. His body toppled in the water. I saw him sink sideways from the beam of my flashlight. The moment his lower body combat suit touched the acidic slurry on the water's surface, it began to foam. Nylon fibers hissed faintly against the acid, the fabric curling up from the bottom edge into a blackened clump. His body stopped all movement within 4 seconds. In the direction he fell, the tubes all coiled toward the aluminum plate in his hand. Dozens of mouths contracted simultaneously, yanking the plate from his grip, wrapping it in layers of tubular bundles, and dragging it toward the sack-like structure on the muddy bed. At that moment, the hull stopped cracking. The gravitational pull that had been sucking our boat bottom toward the sack vanished. The root network directly beneath the hull had all withdrawn, chasing after the aluminum plate. The boat captain and the remaining crew seized the chance to bail water, temporarily plugging the hull cracks with raincoat sleeves, slowing the seepage. The radio man hadn't moved from his spot. The satellite phone was still red. He had it tucked into his tactical vest, his hands free to grip the M4. When he saw Martinez go down, his mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The boat captain got the engine running. The fibers tangled in the propeller had loosened from the earlier gunfire and aluminum reaction. The engine sputtered twice without catching, then coughed to life on the third try. The propeller churned up spray, and the aluminum hull began to edge away. I crouched at the stern, my flashlight still trained on where Martinez had fallen. Those tubes were still churning in that patch of water, wrapping around the aluminum plate, around everything of Martinez's still on the surface, retracting toward the sack on the muddy bed. The tubes retracted as fast as they had struck, all pulling back around the sack within seconds. The chambers on the cyst wall began pulsing again, funneling the newly acquired aluminum plate into the digestive tracts. The moon peeked through the clouds for a moment. Moonlight fell on the swamp. The tail of the C-12 wreck still tilted in the distance, the U.S. Army lettering on it completely dissolved. Across the muddy bed of the entire waterway, the sack sat at the center, its tubular branches fully retracted, compacting itself into a tight hemisphere. The small pores on its surface were still venting gas at regular intervals. The boat captain steered toward the shallower side of Cypress Hill. The hull scraped against the muddy bed, producing a grating sound. I stayed crouched at the stern. In the pooled water at the back, a small aluminum shaving that Martinez had left behind while dismantling the plates earlier floated on the surface. Its edges were slowly turning white, and fine bubbles were forming on its surface. That vibration, once every 7 seconds, came up through the hull, pounding steadily. It came from the direction of that distant sack. It had fed, and it was digesting. The rhythmic pulse of digestion traveled through the mud and water to everything we could touch. The rotor wash from the Black Hawks rippled the swamp's surface. The sky wasn't fully light yet. A sliver of gray-white had just appeared in the east. 2 HH-60s hovered above Cypress Hill, their rope ladders dropping and slapping the water. The first one hoisted up by the winch was Cunningham. The basket spun as it rose. He lay motionless inside, the dressing on his chest soaked through, fluid seeping through the basket's mesh and dripping down. When the medic at the Black Hawk's door reached out to take him, his gloves touched the basket's edge and came into contact with that fluid. The glove tips immediately turned white and bubbled. He stripped the gloves off and tossed them out of the cabin. I was the last one up. As the winch reeled in the cable, the rotor's downwash scattered the layer of yellow acid mist over the water's surface. Looking down from above, the entire swamp had transformed. Within 300 yards of the wreckage coordinates, the mud flats were etched with deep, concentric circles pressed into the mire, each with something at its center. A single-engine civilian aircraft, its aluminum shell corroded away, leaving only the titanium alloy skeleton, lay tilted in the mud. An aluminum flat-bottomed boat, its hull completely dissolved, with only the steel pipe frame along the gunwales remaining. A snapping turtle's shell was wedged where 2 tubular objects crossed, and scattered in the nearest circle were metal fragments. All the aluminum gone, leaving only titanium alloy screws and stainless steel fasteners. A few screws were still caught in the orifices of the tubular objects, which contracted and relaxed, gripping the screws and twisting them repeatedly. When they couldn't turn any further, they stopped, then tried again. The Black Hawk flew north. I sat by the cabin door, looking down. About 40 feet from where Martinez fell, a tubular object protruded from the shallow water near the shore. It pulsed in the morning light, its end orifice half open, contracting every 7 seconds. With each contraction, a small cloud of gray-white vapor sprayed from deep within its cavity, dispersing quickly in the morning breeze. The vapor carried the residual scent of aviation fuel and the dry, powdery feel of aluminum dust. During the dilation between contractions, a dim red light flashed deep within the orifice, on and off and on. The residual heat from the reaction between aluminum and acid. I looked down at my hands. Embedded in the creases of my knuckles were gray-green particles, left behind after the sprayed slurry had dried. Warmed by my body heat and soaked in sweat, the particles were becoming damp again, releasing a pungent, acidic odor. Around the pinprick-sized pits, the flesh had turned pale, and a sharp, piercing pain throbbed. The helicopter flew north over the Tamiami Canal. The swamp receded beneath the fuselage. The tiny pits on the back of my hand were still seeping,